And so back to Jung's quote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Just after that, in the same essay, Jung goes on to say, the latter procedure, and he's referring to that, making the darkness conscious. He says the latter procedure is disagreeable and therefore unpopular. And I think we can see the truth of this in ourselves, and out in the contemporary self-help world as well, books and courses and videos on making the darkness conscious aren't really the ones that sell all that well. What about the light and unity and oneness and being happy and transcending our vulnerability and letting go of our unwanted experience and manifesting something different and thinking positively? And so what about all that? From an alchemical perspective, the lost pieces of the soul, the orphans of psyche and soma, while it can seem that these are obstacles to our path, they are in fact the very path itself. They are the prima materia, the materials we have to work with on the path of tending to the soul. They're an expression of the ally, but the ally who comes in at times in disguised, marginalized, disfigured, frightening, and non-conventional forms. They are allies that can work against the status quo, allies and helpers, we might say, from outside the matrix, outside the networks of misperception and trance. And so if any particular feeling state, sensitivity, or way of expression led to the experience of rejection, abandonment, judgment, shame, it was intelligent to disembody from that experience and to relegate it into the shadow, especially as a young child who just didn't have the capacities emotionally, psychologically, developmentally to process and metabolize that anxiety, fear, and pain. We all have our unique strategies to do this, to split off, to dissociate, to disembody, to abandon ourselves in our embodied vulnerability, to locate certain thoughts, feelings, and expressions into the shadow. And in working with people in therapy, I've come to see that we all have one or two feeling states that we'll do just about anything to avoid, that we've, in fact, organized our lives around not experiencing. Not because we're unevolved or we're broken or we're flawed or because there's something fundamentally wrong with us, but because we're relational mammals with sensitive hearts and nervous systems, and we're wired toward that felt experience of safety. And so you might start to contemplate in your own life, what is that one feeling or experience that I'll do just about anything to avoid, that I've spent so much of my life energy around never having to feel. Perhaps it's the fear of abandonment or of disappointing someone or of being exposed as a fraud or being seen as incapable or being bored or being alone with myself or being too dependent upon another or too independent, to never feel that shame that is there bubbling under the surface, or that rage or that loneliness or whatever it is. So just to say a bit more, or maybe giving an example, going back to this example of anger, which I think is just such an important one, just to see if we can flush it out a little bit more, anger is a good example because so many of us, in my experience, are disconnected from our anger, which likely makes a lot of sense, probably, given our developmental history. And we see this angerophobia playing out even in a lot of our spiritual traditions, which view anger as a sin or evidence of our lack of evolution or a low vibration or certainly as an obstacle to our awakening. Anger is a defilement, an obscuration, it's just the ego gone wild, right? And so even if we might not think these things consciously, these ideas are often quite alive in the spiritual unconscious and in the cultural unconscious. But the problem is that there are serious implications and consequences to not having a conscious, embodied relationship with our own anger, personally, culturally, and also collectively, not to mention in our close personal relationships. And so let's just say in your particular family of origin, it wasn't okay for you to feel or express anger. That when you did, you were met by aggression and an attack and shaming from dad, or it caused mom to become anxious and panicky and run out of the room, or you were left alone with your experience and your feelings and with that rejection and that shame that you did something wrong. How dare you? We've given you so much. We don't act like that in this family. Don't ever speak like that again. You have nothing to be angry about. Don't let anyone see you like that. Get a hold of yourself. Get it together. You're embarrassing us. Don't make me come over there and teach you a lesson. You should be ashamed of yourself. And on and on and on. Maybe some of that sounds familiar. I mean, imagine a little one with a ripening little brain and nervous system and developing sense of self, needing to have his or her emotional reality mirrored back to them. What is their response going to be to the shaming and denial, especially if it occurs hundreds or likely thousands of times, tens of thousands? A complete rejection and dismissing of a very natural and also essential human experience. I mean, here's the thing. Anger is not the problem. The wave of sensation in the body, the images, the waterfall of thoughts, the emotional activation, the heat, the claustrophobia, the stickiness, the burning. This is not the problem. It's an unconscious, disembodied, split off relationship with the experience of anger that's the problem. And all of the ideas we have about what it means about me as a person if a wave of anger appears in my body and mind and nervous system. What does that say about me? And what happens then is that this denied, repressed anger ends up in the shadow, which can lead to all sorts of unintended consequences, violence, unhealthy aggression, and destruction, where it gets acted out, in personal relationships, as well as in cultures, societies, and in wars. And so in the face of all the rejection and the shaming and the dismissing of their emotional state, the little one says, "Oh, I see. I get it. It's unsafe to be angry, to speak up for myself, to assert a need, to enact a boundary, to engage in any sort of protective behavior, even to assert my own viewpoint. I get it now. That's bad. That's unsafe." Of course, they don't say those things, but that's the schema or the internal working model that gets formed. And we very intelligently learn to associate or link the feeling and the expression of anger with the very painful experience of being abandoned, attacked, rejected, and shamed, which are just not safe or workable for a little one, especially if the source of the rejection and the shame is one of our primary attachment figures. And these associations get wired up in the psyche and the nervous system, and we end up with a very understandably phobic or fear-based avoidant relationship with the energy of anger. It all gets sent into the shadow, where of course it will leak out, as we've been discussing, usually in less than ideal and conscious ways. And so the most intelligent, safest, most adaptive response in this example, where anger wasn't allowed, is to disown it, to disembody from it, to push it out of our awareness and to relegate it to the shadow. And then that's step number one. Step number two is to then set our lives up in a way where moving forward, we'll ideally avoid situations where we might become angry. Because if we feel angry, then we might express it. And we know where that leads. And so you can see how this organization of our experience, this particular schema or complex, could start to drastically limit our lives and our sense of spontaneity, of freedom and exploration, especially in relationship. And so our conscious experience then is no anger. I'm not angry. Are you angry? But what happens then is that this torrent of rage starts to build up in the unconscious to compensate for the disowned anger at the conscious level, and forms what Jung called a complex, or a splinter psyche, a split off part of us that has its own autonomy, actually, a part of us that exists outside of the ego, we might say, where at some point it will be touched and awakened, but in a way that's not all that conscious, where it gets acted out in ways that lead to all sorts of psychological and even physical symptoms, including depression. It's this damming up or shutting down of a psychic energy rather than cultivating an embodied, conscious, and even kind relationship with it. And this deeply rooted conclusion that some part of us is unsafe or bad or evil or wrong, which we must keep out of our awareness at all costs. All of these ideas and associations and feelings are stored in what's called a schema, to use therapeutic jargon, or in the language of attachment theory, we call this an internal working model. And these refers to ways of organizing our experience around what we've learned to expect in our relationships, what we've learned to anticipate, and how best to adapt to the reality of those expectations. It's like a template through which we engage life, a certain kind of glasses that we wear. And we learn to set our lives up in a way as best we can to stay out of that shaming, rejecting, dismissive, attacking experience at all costs. And so in our current example, the best way to do that, to prevent ourselves from expressing our anger, would be to never feel it in the first place. So we go out of our way to organize our lives around never becoming angry. But as you might imagine, by doing this, we impose profound limitations on our capacity to love and play and work and explore in the world, all organized around this complex, this emotionally charged cluster of energy, of ideas and associations that came into being several decades ago. And so, yes, while this organization has its origins in our early history, at least in most cases, what happens is that we transfer it into our adult relationships, where we have a phobic relationship with our anger, which leads to all sorts of problems. As a conscious, embodied relationship with our anger, at least in my experience, is essential when it comes to healthy and intimate relationship. I've certainly seen these dynamics play out in my own life, as well as in therapy with couples over the years. So anytime anger or rage or that protective, aggressive energy begins to arise in our experience, we'll likely start to feel anxious, panicky, shut down, depressed, unsafe. But we're not able to make the connection, that experiential linkage between the disembodied, unmetabolized anger and our current experience. And just to further complicate the picture, say we get involved in some sort of spirituality or meditation or some sort of self-help beliefs and practices, and we learn, even if only subtly or implicitly, that anger is evidence that we're stuck in the ego, or it's a low vibration, or an obstacle to our awakening, or a sign of how unevolved we are, and on and on. And so these sort of teachings then fit right into that decades-long mental model, that schema that anger is unsafe and horrible and wrong, and that having and expressing anger is inherently dangerous. And it means that I'm a bad or unspiritual person, and all the related conclusions that go along with that. But the reality is that all of this is usually going on outside of our conscious awareness, meaning we're not aware of this schema or this mental model that's serving as the lens through which we're engaging our lives. But it's not the raw experience of anger, touching that energy and being touched by it emotionally, somatically, at the level of image, and really experiencing and metabolizing it. It's not that material in and of itself that's the problem. There's nothing wrong with or unspiritual or unevolved about an energetic wave of anger in the human nervous system. It's an unconscious, disembodied, dissociated relationship with the very natural energy of anger that's the potential problem. Because if we're in a conscious, embodied, and accepting relationship with our anger, or at least open and curious about the possibilities of that, we're going to be able to feel and express it in a much more whole and healthy way than if it's leaking out of the shadow and coloring our perception. If we're not in contact with it, remember what I mentioned earlier, that if we're not able to access, articulate, verbalize, integrate our anger, then we will locate it onto others, act it out in less than healthy ways in our relationships, or it will become somatized in the body and show up as all sorts of unwelcome symptoms, including exhaustion, depletion, and depression. And so this is just one example of an early environment, say, where anger wasn't allowed or tolerated in our families of origin. But of course, for some of us, anger or aggressive energy was just fine. It was perfectly welcome, permitted, and even a vehicle through which some family members connected with one another. But maybe in our families, anger was fine, but it was sadness that was disallowed or marginalized, or expressing too much independence or free thinking, or too much dependency, being too clingy or sensitive, or expressing pride, or being melancholic, or too introverted, or too extroverted, or too sensitive, or too eccentric. And, each of these qualities, expressions, and ways of being are prime candidates to become shadow material. And if their expression was disavowed, shamed, judged, attacked, if that expression somehow disrupted that critical attachment bond with one of our caregivers, we had no choice really than to push that material outside our conscious awareness and into the shadow, and then begin to organize our lives in a way where, if at all possible, we would never feel these things. Or even if we did, we would somehow be able to withhold our expression of them, stuff them, repress them, dissociate, disembody. But the consequences of this sort of self-abandonment, of bailing out of our bodies, of attacking our historic core vulnerabilities and sensitivities, the consequences and implications of this are tragic, really. And in my experience, as I mentioned, can lead to that experience of soul loss, of exhaustion, of lack of energy, and a real sense of meaninglessness, or even chronic anxiety and depression. About this phrase, the unlived life, that I sometimes use, it's an evocative phrase, to be sure. Like it has a way of evoking some feeling, but what does it actually mean? What am I talking about? And so maybe let's just touch in on that for a moment. And the basic idea with this is that we all have parts of our lives, parts of our soul print, you might say, that we weren't able to live as a result of having to repress, to deny, or turn off certain parts of ourselves as young children. It's like experience that was theoretically possible or even really needed. Certain ways of being held or seen, or certain developmental tasks we needed to accomplish. But it wasn't possible due to a variety of factors, not to mention sort of forms of play, of creativity, of exploration. So maybe it would help to give an example. I didn't realize how common this is actually until it surfaced a handful of times in my clinical work. I may have mentioned this in an earlier session, but a few of you had asked about it. There's a particular dynamic in early life for many of us, actually, where we were forced into the role of taking care of the unlived life of one of our attachment figures. And in this situation, our sense of self-worth and self-value became tangled up in how well we were able to meet their narcissistic needs, to prop up and hold together their what was a very fragile sense of self. And in this sort of relational environment, we aren't seen or related to as a subject in our own right, but as a mere object in the awareness of the other. And this denial of our subjectivity is the essence of what we refer to as narcissistic injury, a unique form of wounding that goes to the very core of our developing sense of self. And our value as a person isn't seen then in our unique qualities, sensitivities, perceptions, and experiences, but in how well we were able to compensate and remedy the anxiety, the depression, the fragmentation in the other. But this is just not what the little developing brain and psyche and nervous system was designed to do. And we could just imagine the unwanted consequences of this, the effects it has on our brain and nervous system, not to mention on our tender little heart. And what happens within this particular configuration is that we're denied the life of a child, where our psychic and emotional energy becomes tangled and ultimately exhausted in this project of narcissism. And we're unable to play, to explore, to move within more unstructured states of consciousness, and to have our emotional experience validated, held, and mirrored back to us. And our little brains really need all that. It's not just an added bonus, it's required. And so there's no ongoing attunement, but only consistent failures and missed opportunities of empathy and validation. And in the language of psychoanalytic self-psychology, there is no mirroring, no idealization, and no self-object to reflect back to us the validity and the uniqueness and the integrity of our own interiority. And to say it a different way, what's denied is our own soul, our nature as an ensouled individual and unique being. And so with respect to this idea of the unlived life, what's unlived in this scenario, what falls into the shadow, is the life of the child. That capacity to play, to explore, to dream, to imagine, and to have another person be immersed empathically in our unfolding psychic and emotional life. And so this experience becomes unlived in the body, in the psyche, and deep in the soul. It's a strange word, and one that's not used all that often, but it refers to something that is potential as experience. And not only that, but experience that is necessary and important for the unfolding of our own soul. And this denial of soul, to use that language, can be experienced, and understandably so, as a real soul level betrayal. And in my experience, the illuminating and working through of this betrayal is something that usually remains unattended in our modern world, including in many of our spiritualities and therapies. Unfortunately, it's just something that's often overlooked, with some exceptions, of course. But working through this primordial level of betrayal is linked to the working the working through and integration of grief. More generally, though, it does have its specific fragrances and qualities. I suppose we could say it's the most basic form of grief, the grief of the unlived life. And so as we deepen in our own opus, our own alchemical lab work, we open a portal through which these unlived aspects of our experience can become illuminated and available for relationship. They're filled with light, which is the metaphor we use for the illumination of shadow material, this light being a metaphor for that discerning, warm, curious, compassionate discernment and awareness.